Hello, everybody. Welcome to TMYS Academy's first time poetry session. I'm Shelly Bhoil, an Indian poet and research scholar living in Brazil. Yes, you heard that right. Brazil, the current hotspot of coronavirus, unfortunately. And I have with me the very special Maria Mazzioti Gillan. Maria has over 20 books and 40 edited anthologies. She is the founder of the Poetry Center in Paterson, which is visited by poet laureates and Pulitzer Prize winners since the 1980s. She has been given 2014 George Garnett Award for Outstanding Community Service in Literature. Maria has also received 2011 Barnes and Noble's Writers for Writers Award, 2008 American Book Awards, and these are just a few things that I'm mentioning. She is also the Bartle Professor and Professor Emerita of English and Creative Writing at Binghamton University. And to me, what is most special about Maria is that she is a courageous, honest, and truthful poet. So Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to connect across distance, isn't it?
So I'll begin with the idea that what Billy Collins says, that in poetry, we can trace the history of human emotions, of human heart. We name an emotion and we have a poem on that. We have poems for death, poems for birth, poems for marriage, poems for separation, and we have poetry for pandemic. So what do you think is the role of poetry in current times of pandemic, and which poem resonates with you the most in these times? And if you can also kindly begin with the reading of the poem.
Okay, I think in times of stress like this, but in all times of grief or loss or sorrow, poetry is a way of healing. Poetry is a way of exploring what we feel in a situation and reaching out and making a connection to other people, to give them permission to tell their story, to give them permission to talk about their fears and the way they feel so small in a time like this, a pandemic, where so many people are dying. Where so much lying is going on about how many people are dying. And it's, in a way, it's as much a balm as when you put an aloe plant on, the juice of an aloe plant on a burn. I think that's what poetry does. Put the juice of an aloe plant on a burn. I don't have a poem specifically about the pandemic, but I do have a poem I'd like to read about the time after my husband of 46 years died 10 years ago. And it was the same time when we had the BP oil spill. And it was very important for me to write that poem because I was grieving for the earth and what we've done to destroy it. And we have done an enormous amount to destroy it. And the way my husband was destroyed by the disease. I couldn't write directly about his illness, but I could write about it in the context of the BP oil spill. So I'm going to read that, which for me is a very important poem because I had to write about the both things at the same time. Grief is not limited to one thing, I think. On TV, I watched a pelican with its mouth wide open, its wings and body coated with oil. Is it screaming? I do not hear the sound, and since it's a photograph, I don't know it was caught in that mouth-stretched howl when it died, or if it's howling in recognition that it cannot survive the thick coat of oil that bears it down. The ladies who take care of me when I'm gone tell me you're having trouble. His hands, they say, his hands. When I come home, I see your hands have turned black at the tips, the ends of your fingers eaten away. I watched a dead bird in the Gulf floating on top of the water with its legs stiff and straight in the air, its body drained of all motion, all light. The announcer on CNN says BP didn't want the photographer to take pictures of dying birds, covered as they are with the black slick of oil. They were hoping, he says, that the birds would sink and the evidence would be swallowed by the ocean. In a late afternoon, I hear my daughter cry out. I rush to see what's happening. You are stretched out on the bed. Your body's so thin, you look like a boy. I call 911. The ambulance takes you to the hospital. BP is trying to put a cap on the spewing oil rig. The CEO keeps saying it's no problem. Clumps of oil wash ashore, float on the surface of the water. The beach littered with dead fish and birds. At the hospital, they want to know whether we want extraordinary measures. No, I say, he has a living will. You hover around while they admit you have forgotten how to speak. Mostly you lie in bed, staring into a space above our heads. I reach out to hold your hand, stroke your forehead. Dennis, I say, you're not here. The neurologist comes in, says, what did you expect? You shouldn't have taken such good care of him. We did everything we could, the BP president says, looking directly at the camera. It's not such a calamity. We don't need to stop deep water drilling. Our economy will collapse if we do. The social worker tells me, you should put him in a nursing home. My brother tells me, you should keep him home. You kept him home all this time. If he gets a little stronger, I'll let him go back, and he'll be around the things he knows. Another doctor enters and says, he's not going to make it. The social worker admonishes us with her bag of common sense. She does not love you. We take you home. I sit next to you and hold your hand. The MSNBC reporter stands on the beach in a hurricane and picks up a huge glob of oil with a stick. Look, she says, look, and drips the oil on the white sand. She's shaking with fury, such destruction. Dead birds float by behind her. I am in so much pain, you say. You have not complained before. I feed you a jar of baby applesauce. You open your mouth and accept the food. When I see the pelican on TV with its mouth wide open in horror, I remember you as you lay dying. On the Gulf, the earth and the sea are being destroyed, just as you were by the disease that finally defeated you. Some things are bigger than all of us. We cannot defeat them. If there is enough carelessness and greed in the world, even the ocean can be destroyed. And you fought against this illness with such courage that even you cannot survive. The blackened tips of your fingers, the oil heavy on the bird's feathers, the birds dead and floating on the surface that gradually sink and disappear.
My goodness. Professor Gillan, listening to this poem had an impact on me, a kind of effect of as though I'm getting a vaccine poetry, for this grief that we have, so much grief around, that we have grief which is collecting from centuries, and maybe at present it seems to be accumulated, So it is like, you're immersing yourself in the grief through poetry to build immunity and to have a kind of build some kind of antibody against, indifference that we have in the world. This is beautiful. How do you do that? It reminds me of something, Yes?
That going back and forth is something I'm doing more and more lately in my poetry, that sort of weaving in and out the present and the past, memory and what's going on right now. And my poetry has changed. From when I was a child, I fell in love with poetry and the sound of it, and I loved imagery, and I loved Japanese haiku. I read millions of poems and wrote thousands of poems of haiku, which were almost all imagery and language. And gradually over the years, my work has changed dramatically. But I was 40 before I had the courage to really write about myself and my life. Before that, I was trying to write poems about Greek gods. I want to prove how I was an immigrant child. We were poor. I was trying to prove that I was smart, that I wasn't just this kid who couldn't speak English when she went to school. Trying to prove that I was worthy of being included in literary books. And it wasn't until I was 40, I'd gone back to graduate school. My children were growing up, and I went back to graduate school, and a graduate professor told me, a graduate school professor said, if in this book, it's in this poem about your father that you find the story you have to tell. And I was 40. My first book had been published. I'd won a big prize for the book. It was imitation of the English Romantic poets, who were all wealthy. they had nothing to do with my life or the kind of life I had lived. And for the first time, I thought maybe somebody would be interested in poems by an immigrant poet. Maybe somebody would be interested in poetry by a wife, a mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, the life of a person growing up in a lower class neighborhood in a big city that was failing. And maybe that's something I can write about, and I can write about it with honesty and directness. And I had to get brave to do that, because before that I was trying to hide behind language. And as the more I wrote about my life and was willing to share and be honest, the braver I got. So I made it my mission in life to get my students to do that, to realize that whatever story they have to tell, whatever it is, they have to look at the world through their own eyes. They have to be willing to be vulnerable on page, willing to share their stories with the world. I hear somebody.
Yes. You know, in fact, as I've been reading your poems, I feel a deep connect with your poems. You know, poems that you might have written 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they resonate with me. And I, as a mother, connect with your poems. I connect with your poems as a woman. I connect with your poems as a daughter. And something about your poetry that totally it sort of erased my bias. It made me look at my own bias, stare at myself, of my assumptions, is that the kind of struggles that we have vis-a-vis class, or we have, with language, these struggles only belong to the people of color. I didn't know that people who are white like you would also have these struggles, So it has really made me look at my own bias, and it has shaken me off. It's amazing, And your poetry has this very platin, silver plat kind of a confessional mode, which is of course different trajectories, but it's very confessional, and this clarity, and one can see through, and one wants to revisit the poems, read them again, and each time reading these poems is a feeling of, like coming home to yourself. So what I want to ask you now is that you tell your students that poems hide in a cave, very deep place inside of you, and that place is guarded by a crow. So could you explain to the audience the metaphor of the cave and the crow?
Certainly. It's very important to me that idea that the crow has in his voice every negative thing that's ever been said to us. So it makes us afraid. It makes us afraid to show ourselves, to reveal ourselves. It whispers in our ears and says, no, you can't say that. One big thing in Italian families where you weren't allowed to talk about what went on in the house, outside of the house. That it was shameful to talk about what went on inside the house. My mother was horrified in the beginning by my poems. She wanted me to make up a life of leisure, privilege, and wealth, which I didn't know anything about. And it took a long time for her to accept that that was not the kind of poem that I was going to write. The crow will keep you from doing anything in your life, whether it's writing poems or painting or being a great lawyer, great doctor, because it will make you insecure, feel that you don't have to write and nobody's going to listen to you. My crow always says, who wants to hear from an immigrant kid from a poor tenement in Paterson, New Jersey? Who cares what you have to say? That's what my crow says. We all have one. And I feel that in order to write, you have to move down into this cave in your body. And the cave is dark and scary, and it has in it every good thing that's ever happened to you and every bad thing that's ever happened to you. And you have to give yourself the courage to go open the door and go in there and write about what you find, honestly, clearly, directly, with a lot of detail, so that you can recreate the world you know and give other people permission to recreate the world that they know. Your world is not going to be my world, but if I can give you the courage to detail your world as it exists, then I've given you something great, it seems to me. I have to show you the cover of my writing book, and I have to say, this press is in Canada. And see the crow? He's the shoulder of this figure. And the book called Writing Poetry to Save Your Life, How to Find the Courage to Tell Your Stories. When the publisher had the graphic designer who did the cover call me up, and he wanted put a vase of flowers on the cover. And I said, no, 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 that's not what I'm doing. And I explained the whole thing to him. And he went back and he did this cover. And I was so thrilled that this man who was a graphic designer was able to understand very clearly what I was trying to do with the idea of the crow that we, the critic, it's really the critic inside. You're a literary scholar. You know how critic can be a very negative voice in your head. We all have a critic. We all have this critic who's going to try to keep us under his thumb. We have to knock the critic out. You have to knock the crow off your shoulder and write whatever it is that you have to write at that moment without you. And I do a lot of workshops with students. I teach graduate students, but also I teach workshops in, for example, in a retreat house. It's not a religious workshop, it's a poetry workshop. And I always tell them, you know, you have 20 minutes to write a poem. And I give them some suggestions about what they could write. And then they have 20 minutes to write it. And I tell them, do not correct the poem as you're going along. This is the moment to find the poem, that you need to write. Later on, you can correct it and revise it and fix the language. But this is the moment for finding the truth of the poem and the story you have to tell. And it's such a wonderful feeling to have them write poems that they didn't think they could write about that subject, and then suddenly there they are writing about the subject. So that's what I've dedicated my life to doing, trying to get people to be able to reach that spot where they tell the truth.
Wonderful. You know, in this very book, you talk about the poetry police, and I believe that poetry police is a kind of a crow, right? And you talk about the electricity of poetry that I believe comes from the cave if we go and explore the cave, right?
Right. There is a kind of electricity that happens when you're telling the truth in a poem. You can feel it in the way the audience responds to you. In the beginning, I thought they all had colds because they'd be crying or they'd be blowing their noses. And I didn't understand that they were reacting to my poems. That was when I was about your age. I was 40. And I'd read a poem and people would be blowing their noses and wiping their, and I thought everybody in the room had a cold. And then after a while, I realized, no, they're reacting to your poem, which was a wonderful, enabling kind of thing to realize that I was touching them in a place so deep that they were able to react emotionally. I want people to react to poetry so that the hair on the back of their neck stands up, so that they have tears in their eyes. Poetry is a very physical thing. It's language, but it's also the way language gets past all your barriers. That seems to me to be exceedingly important. That's what I want when I read. I want people to have that moment. When I find a wonderful poet, I know I found a wonderful poet because the hair on the back of my neck stands up when I hear them. I know I found a wonderful poet when the poem makes me cry, even if I've read it 20 times. And it still reaches me. It still makes me cry. It still makes me shiver. That's what I'm trying to do in my own work. It may not always work, but it's certainly what I'm aiming for.
Right. So, you know, what I want to talk about now is that these days we have in vogue, we have in fashion, poems that are very algebraic, esoteric, soulless. Poems where poem, they say, is the content. What do you think about this kind of poems? I feel it's like,
I hate that kind of poems. I hate that kind of poem. I've been struck, you know, because I was the head of a graduate program in a big university, and I'm just retired now, but, well, actually, I'll retire as of August 30th. But I spent all the time that I was there working really hard against that kind of poem. And I call it the MFA poem, the graduate school poem, where you're trying to prove how brilliant you are by making the poem inaccessible to everyone. I believe, think about the Greeks when they wrote. They had traveling minstrels. They read the poems out loud. They had big audiences for poetry because they were working from myth, but from stories that illuminated people's lives, and people wanted to hear them. They were based in narrative. All of a sudden, we have language poetry that's incomprehensible. We have poetry that makes people feel stupid. And a lot of people hate, when I was growing up, there was a lot of very esoteric poetry being written, And people taught it in schools, and it made them feel stupid. They didn't understand it, so they ended up hating poetry. When my first book was published in Neighborhood, and it really wasn't very good, I have to say. It won prizes, but I know it wasn't very good. But a neighbor called me and she said, you know, I've always hated poetry. I didn't understand that I hated poetry. She said, but I love your poetry. Now, that's just what I wanted to hear. She had 4 sons. They were all football players. They all carry the book around. We're fighting over who gets to keep the book. And I love hearing that. I love hearing that people are moved in some way by the poems and that people want to read them. I think this movement toward language poetry and esoteric poetry is very bad for poetry. Literature that is incomprehensible just makes people hate literature. And William Faulkner said a wonderful thing when he got the Nobel Peace Prize. It took him a long time to get that award. But when he got the award, he said, people have forgotten that literature is about the truths of the human heart. And it's something I've taken in my heart and tried to remember when I'm reading and when I'm teaching. Literature really is not about the head and the intellect and philosophy. It's really about what it means to love, what it means to grieve, what it means to mourn, what it means to care about the world. What do we do in a time like this if we don't have someplace to go for comfort? We need poetry for comfort. I think that's really what we need. We need to feel that connection. And in time, I've been in the house for 9 weeks now, 10 weeks, I think. And I love people. I've been around people my whole life. I really quite can't stand this. We have no choice but to stay inside at this point. But I find I miss people terribly. And the one way I get over it is by reading poems to myself.
Wonderful. So we can say poetry is your superpower in this time of crisis.
Yes,
right?
very, very much so. And I hope it helps other people as well.
Yes. I want to ask you that, can we have good poems without the knowledge of meter and form? Can good poems be written without this kind of knowledge?
I think that, meter and form is wonderful. And I always loved those 19th century poets and the 18th century poets, particularly the 19th century poets, I have to say. I did love them, and I love their music, the music in their poems. But I think that there was enormous change with Walt Whitman, who used free verse and very long lines. It was a big change in American poetry. I've read in Europe, and I read in Russia, I've read in Finland. They were very different poets in some of these countries. They're very much into philosophical poems, much more esoteric kinds of poems. What I found in America is that because we had Whitman, he kind of opened a door in poetry that you could write about yourself, you could celebrate, and that was okay to do. It took us then another 60 years to get to Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg, when he first went to school at Columbia, he tried to write the kind of poems they were writing there. And he wrote to William Carlos Williams, who's a famous American poet who died many years ago. And Williams did not write personal poems himself, not in the way that I write them or the way that Ginsberg wrote them. But he told Allen that he really found what he had to say in his letters. That his letters were much better than the poems he was writing at Columbia, where they were getting him to write in meter and form and about waterfowl. And William said to him, "You don't know anything about waterfowl. What do you know about that? Why aren't you writing about what you know?" And Ginsberg went home and he wrote Howl, he wrote Kaddish, he wrote America, poems that radically changed American literature. And they changed literature for me and for many women poets. It kind of opened the door for women poets, for Black poets, for people of color, which were not invited in to the American and English literature canon until the moment that Ginsberg put a big bomb into it. So I think it's very important to remember that. I know that it's hard for people to give up meter and form. And I think you should only do it if you really have a very good ear. If you don't have a good ear for the music of language, please don't do it, because it gives me such a pain when I hear bad poetry written where the ends of the lines collapse like a rock hitting the bottom of a pond. And if you don't have that ear, you cannot write poetry in rhyme. Please don't. You make me ill. and I know there's a very famous poet who writes in rhyme all the time, and he is terrible. His lines end like this. Instead of ending and flowing the way Shakespeare's lines end and flow, he's writing in meter, but you're not thinking this man is writing a meter. You're thinking this moves beautifully. This other man, I'm not going to name his names because he got a big prize, but I think he's terrible. You hear him read, and his ends of his lines collapse like a rock. So I advise people, if they're going to write in rhyme, they better really understand the music of language with their ears. And it means they have to struggle to do that.
Professor Gillan, I wanted to ask you about the utility of the creative writing courses in sort of, understanding the music of poetry, and even, getting encouraged or understanding how you can get to your own cave, your own resource inside of you to write poetry. This novelist and professor Hanif Qureshi, he says that creative writing course is a waste of time. But novelist Matt Haig defends that it's as useful as we have music lessons, What is your take on creative writing courses? And
I think that there are some wonderful creative writing courses, and there were some terrible creative writing courses. The terrible ones I call, they're creating poems like sausages. They're all using the same kind of lineation. They're using the same kind of language. That's not what I was trying to do in my poetry class. I tried to make them understand that what they had to say had to be really clear to themselves, and they had to make it clear to the reader. That's not true of many MFA programs. You could sort of tell what poems were written in some MFA programs because they sound alike. So you could throw them in a pile and you wouldn't be able to tell one poem from the other. That's not what I encourage my students. I'm very proud to say my students have gone to win big prizes. They've published books. They've gotten awards for their poems. I love that. It makes me so happy to think that they're succeeding in the world of poetry where it's so difficult to succeed.
I wish I was a student. I wish I was in the US and I was studying with you. I really wish so. Maybe one day. All right. So, I wanted you to read a poem. I requested you to read a poem for our audience before we move forward with discussing other things.
You wanted me to read a poem, but I can't face someone I love. That my son. That's how my son loves me, but prefer not to see me too much. Every Sunday night when I call him in North Carolina, he lives with his wife and 2 children. I can hear the heaviness in his voice, his hello tempered with impatience, our conversation stiff and stilted. They always think I can talk to a stone. Strangers in buses and trains tell me their life histories. Acquaintances tell me about their affairs and shattered marriages, show me the secret undersides of their lives. My graduate students vie for my attention. They want to sit next to me and carry my bags and fetch my lunch. But my son can't wait to get off the phone with me. Ask him how the children are, or specific questions about school. Ask about his wife, his job. He answers with 1 or 2 words. They're fine, or the same, or okay. My son is a lawyer. He was always brilliant with language, at least written language, and he can read a 300-page book in an hour and remember every detail. But with me, he turns mute and dumb. If I ask for help with some legal problem, he will give it. But I do not hear in his voice the lilt I hear in my daughter's voice when I call her. Instead, I hear reluctance, as though his attention were focused on some truly fascinating person, and he can't wait to get off the phone. I tell stories that I hope will amuse him, but finally, after struggling and finding no response, I can't wait to hang up. I say, well, John, have a good week. Give everyone a hug for me. I know my son has divorced me somewhere deep inside himself in a place he doesn't look at. I am too much for him, too loud, too dramatic, too frantic, too emotional. I laugh too much. I wear him out in a minute and a half. If he didn't see me again, he wouldn't miss me. And this is what I can't face about someone I love. That was a very hard.
That was fantastic, fantastic. Maria, you know, you are a reservoir of knowledge. You have an archive of experiences, not only as a poet, but also somebody who brought poetry to Paterson like never before through the Poetry Center. I wanted to ask you that the poetry has a very deep relationship with pen and paper. With the coming of the keyboard and screens, has it changed for good or for bad?
Well, you know, it's in a way it's a lot easier, but for me, I'm old enough that I have to write my poems by hand. And sometimes in my workshops, students will write on a computer, but a lot of students still write by hand. There's something about the pen and the paper for me that enables me to let go, and my pen moves faster and faster as I get to where I have to go in the poem. Sometimes I have to throw out the first 10 or 20 lines, but I have to let myself go where I'm going to go. And there's a relationship for me between the pen and the page that allows me freedom. Now, people who were raised on using computers, they're not going to feel that way. They feel the connection to the keyboard. The advantage for me of the internet and the computer is that once I type the poem into the computer, I write it out by hand, then I type it into the computer. I do revision while I'm typing it into the computer. And then I can really look at it and make changes. That's much easier. When I went to graduate school in the 70s, we had to use an electric typewriter, but every time you made a mistake, you had to correct it with a little correctate thing that you had to, it took hours. And then when you printed out the paper, then you were stuck. If there were any changes, you had to retype the whole thing. It took hours to do anything. I did my graduate school papers, having every time there was a mistake, I had to retype the whole thing, and I'm not that great a typist. So it was very hard, but now you can make changes on a computer, but I still want to write on a lined pad or in a journal. I still feel connected to that in a way that I don't when I'm typing. It's good for revision for me, but somebody who's raised on the computer, they're able to type very quickly and they know how to move things around. I have to call my secretary, Smita, help me.
Right, right. So coming from poetry to poets, the personality of poets, the cults in the poetry world, you know, like we have Instagram poets like Ruby Kaur. So a lot of people say that Ruby Kaur, like, you know, she wouldn't follow a poet until a few years ago. And her poems are like Archie cards, you know, like we have these Hallmark and Archie cards that we have in the shops. And her estimated net worth is 1 to 5 million. While I agree to some of the criticism that we have of Ruby Kaur's poetry, but I do not agree to a lot of it because her poetry does have a mass appeal. That's why it sells, you know. But maybe it also sells because of the herd mentality of just sort of, you know, okay, Ruby Kaur is selling, so let's all buy Ruby Kaur. What do you think about this?
Right.
Where do you?
I think I'm always suspicious of a poet who doesn't want to read. I'm very suspicious of any poet who won't read. I believe that we learn so much from reading other poets. For me, I immersed myself in poetry. I started reading poetry when I was a young child. It was very important to me. It influenced my own work a lot in the beginning. The poets I was reading, I was trying to write like them. And then when I got to high school, I learned more about poetry. The more I learned about poetry, the more I loved reading it out loud and hearing it read out loud and absorbing the language of it and the music of it. I really encourage my students to read a lot of poetry, to read anything, to get the language into their bodies so that it becomes a part of them. And I don't trust the ones who say, oh, I don't read anybody else. Well, why not? Do you love language or don't you love language? Do you love poetry or do you just love your own poetry? So I feel it's very important for them to read. I know that there are Instagram poets who are making millions of dollars. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm glad they're popular and good for them. But with my own students, I really, really force them to read, whether they want to or not. I'm very suspicious of any of my students who say, oh, I don't need to read because I'm only interested in what I have to say. Well, good. But you're never going to grow from that if you don't read what other people are doing. And you have to read the classics too. You have to get all of that. And then it comes novels, classic poetry. You have to get it all absorbed. All becomes part of what you draw on when you write your own poem. Everything that you read, everything that you listen to. I'm a big fan of poetry CDs that you can put in a car. And you put them and you listen to them. And it really goes into your body the way music goes into your body. And then when you're calling up your own poem, you're calling on this whole library of other voices. And so I think it's important. I know that we have a lot of slam poets, but I try to encourage everybody to read and to read and listen to other poets, to go to readings, to hear what other people are doing. I've done a lot with bringing poetry to Paterson, bringing famous poets, bringing Pulitzer Prize-winning poets to Paterson, like Stanley Kunis, died about 10 years ago, but who was an absolutely wonderful poet with a generous spirit who helped so many poets. And he was such an amazing poet himself. He came to read for me when he was 96 years old, 96 years old. And he stayed for the open reading, which means he was willing to listen to the other poets. And this was after he spent about 2 hours signing books. Now he's 96 years old. And he came and he listened to the open reading. He listened to the other poets. He didn't have to do that. He was already very famous. He'd been poet laureate of the United States twice. He won the Pulitzer Prize. What else do you need? At his age, he could have said, I'm tired, I'm going home. He didn't do that. He stayed and listened. Allen Ginsberg was the same thing, this way. He would stay, he would listen to everybody, he would sign, he would look at people's poems, he would sign books for hours. And I love that generosity of spirit that wants to pass on something we love. We do love poetry. I love everybody. So I love my own poetry. Everybody loves their own poetry. I love so many other poets who are so wonderful and so amazing. They have given me so much comfort. When my children were little, I remember that I never had any time during the day because I was teaching, I was doing housework, I had laundry, I had to cook, I had to take care of my children. So I'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I would read. I'd read Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, or Sylvia Plath, or Amy Lowell. I'd read May Sarton. I'd read all these poets. After I read, I felt that they were with me in the kitchen. I would be in my own kitchen, and I felt their voices were comforting, and that I was learning something about myself by reading their poems. And then I would write in my journal, and then the next thing I knew, I'd be writing a poem. I will always be grateful to Adrienne Rich for the poem that she wrote about looking across at her neighbor who was walking around the class, her house, her kitchen, wrapped in a shawl. And Adrienne Richards was in her own kitchen, also wrapped in a shawl. And she looked across the backyard at this other neighbor, and she felt a connection with her as they walked alone with her own demons in her kitchen and the neighbor walking in her kitchen. I felt that she had invited me in to her world, and it was comforting to know that there was somebody else walking around a 3 a.m. kitchen trying to make sense of their lives and writing. So that's a wonderful thing for me. And I will always be grateful to her for that.
Wonderful. You know, Colin Keegan, the Irish musician and songwriter, he wants to ask, when does the need to read a poem arise? What itch does it scratch?
For me, when I'm depressed or when I'm down, like musicians listen to music to make them feel better, I read poetry to make me feel better. So I read a poet whose work I love. I read it out, but sometimes I memorize it. Dylan Thomas. In my craft or sullen exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed, all their griefs in their arms. I labor by singing light, not for ambition or bread, or the and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of the human heart, not for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms around the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages or heed my craft or art. I did a terrible job of reading as I'm losing my voice, but when I'm depressed, I read the poems out loud. I recite the poems out loud. When I'm taking a shower, I'm reading E. Cummings. I'm reciting E. Cummings, Somewhere I've Never Traveled, poem out loud. It makes me feel better. It makes me feel connected to the world. It's as soothing as a chocolate. You know how soothing chocolate can be.
Right. So now I'm going to ask you some questions, rapid fire questions. What is the most memorable pinch me moment in your literary career?
Oh God, I've been so lucky. I've been so fortunate. I've had some wonderful pinch me moments. One, when I won the American Literary Translators Award, and I went to do a 10-day reading tour in Sicily, and my translator and his wife arranged all these readings in different parts of Sicily where I'd never been before, and I read in a big arena, and there were about 300,000 people there. And that was a pinch me moment for sure. Like, oh my God, here I am. And on that trip, another pinch me moment was when we got to this little town. It was the first night that we got there. And it was a tiny little town, and we couldn't even park near this library we were going to read. And we walked down this hill, and we get into the doorway of the library, and I discovered we had to climb 4 flights of stairs to get to the meeting room. I was so much better conditioned then. And we climbed 4 flights of stairs, and I thought, who's going to come to this? And we got up there, and the room was packed with about 750 people. People were all dressed up. Whole families came. It was so wonderful and so amazing. It took me months to get off the high that put me on. There have been a few years ago, my poem was used in, one of my poems was used in the Italian language exam in Italy for all the graduating seniors. And the cultural minister of the town where my mother came from in the mountains in southern Italy wrote to me and said, I wonder if this Cilento you're talking about is Cilento in Provincia di Salerno. Apparently there are other places like that, San Mauro. And so I said, yes, it is. Well, he went to the town and he looked at my mother's birth certificate, her marriage certificate, her mother and father's birth certificates, my father's mother's mother and father's birth certificates, all of that. And then he wrote to me and he said, we'd like to make you an honorary citizen of the town. Will you be willing to come? And so that's a whole day of celebrations. They were lined up outside the door. They couldn't fit people in the town hall, but everybody in the town came, and they did a dinner, a lunch. They gave me flowers, several bouquets of flowers. They had somebody read my poems in Italian. It was so amazing. And then a few years later, they invited me back again, and they published a book of my poems in Italian and English. And we met in the town square, and the town band followed me. And I brought my grandson with me. My grandson, who was 19. I don't know if he was embarrassed or pleased. I'm not sure. Probably a little of both. And the band followed us into the town square. And when we get there are all these chairs set out, and they're full. And they start reading my poems in Italian. And people started getting up and getting the book. Everybody wanted the book. And then they took me over to the wall of my mother's house where she was born, and on it. And they pulled the red cloth off, and they had a plaque dedicated to my mother and father and to me on the wall of my mother's house. It was so beautiful. It was such a wonderful moment. Definitely a PT moment.
What are the 5 essential ingredients of a good poem for you? 5.
The 5 is
Name me 5.
detail, honesty,
Okay.
a kind of music in the language that doesn't have to be rhymed music or iambic pentameter, but you have to find a way to give the spoken language music. You have to have images in the poems that are true to you, not some old-fashioned image of a bird, but images that are true to the life that you live. People, the sound of people, the way people speak, the way you have to be honest about what people speak around you.
Now, could you give us 2 poetry prompts for COVID times?
For COVID time, okay.
2 prompts.
What makes me so afraid about being alone?
Okay,
what makes
wonderful.
me so afraid about being alone? What is it about being in a house that saves me? Being closed in a house that saves me?
Fantastic. It's a really good poetry prompts that I'm going to work on. The last but not the least, there must be 1 poem that you find yourself taking refuge in, going back to again and again. Could you tell what poem is that? And can you read that poem to end the session?
Yeah, I'm going to read a poem that my mother died about 25 years ago. And I'm going to read a poem about her because she was a very major figure in my life. And she was bossy and I didn't understand her. And when I was your age, I'd scream at her, hang up on her, that kind of thing. Then your own children do that to you, and then you say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Little General. My brother called our mother the Little General when we were teenagers. My brother driving the car, my mother sitting next to her, ahead, a small dark knob, barely reaching the top of the seat. My bossy mother who told us how to live our lives. My mother who was always moving. When I remember her, I see her almost as a blur, like the cartoon of the Roadrunner. My mother who washed all the dishes as soon as the last bite of food vanished from the plate. My mother who held my doctor brother's foot until he fell asleep when he was still a boy. My mother who sat at the kitchen table with us, always ready to hear the stories of our lives, ready to tell the story of hers. My mother who told me everything that was wrong with me. So I still hear her voice, though she has said she told me for my own good. My mother who loved the feel of the earth on her hands, who smelled the flour and spices, who baked thousands of loaves of bread, cooked innumerable fragrant meals for her children and grandchildren in her basement kitchen. My mother who taught me how to laugh. My mother who could not read or write. And though she wanted to go to school, my father wouldn't let her. Women don't need to go to school, he said. My mother who did not know how much money my father had in the bank and never wrote a check. My mother who wanted to learn how to do everything. My mother who could quote poems she memorized in 3rd grade in Italy before she had to leave school. My mother who drew an imaginary line around us to keep us close. The front stoop, our boundary, the family, our country, the little sturdy body, better than any magic charm. My mother whose skin turned orange before she died, but the week before she got sick, she planted a huge garden. Who was sure she was too powerful to die. Ma, even now, 25 years after the funeral procession that led us to Calvary Cemetery and to the mausoleum drawer they filed you in, I wish I could drive over to your house and find you there, your earthy humor, warm arms that always were the place I called home.
Fantastic, fantastic, wonderful.
I had to make up for all the time I was so mean to her.
I think we all are, and then we learn, we unlearn, we relearn, we negotiate our relationships. I have learned a lot from your poems about I have seen my own relationships in your poems, strangely, we meet in poems. Right. So it's a wonderful point to end the session, and though the session comes formally to an end, but I will continue, and I'm sure our audience too will continue to hear your voice as it will guide us into the cave in our own beings and shoo off the crows, get rid of the crows that tend to censor us. Actually, that we have two poetry prompts. That is, one is what makes us afraid of being at home, and the second one, what makes us feel safe at home. So this is really wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Gillan. Thank you so much for coming to TM Bias Academy, and I'm grateful to Koral Dasgupta for this initiative. It's really enriching to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.